He leaned across the white tablecloth, looked directly at me, and said in rapid, precise French, to his companions, not to me, as if I were furniture, "The help clearly doesn't understand what we're saying, which makes this considerably more enjoyable." His friends laughed. He picked up the menu with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing this particular kind of cruelty for decades. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that French was the language I had grown up in, the language my grandmother had taught me before English, the language I dreamed in on difficult nights. And what I said back to him, in the same accent and register he had used, in front of a dining room that had gone perfectly silent, ended his evening and began the most consequential week of my professional life. But that evening at the restaurant was only the surface. Underneath it was a story that had been building for 3 years, and the man at that table was not the only one who had underestimated me. He was just the one who did it in public, where everyone could see exactly how badly he'd miscalculated.
My name is Sophie Aldrin, and for 3 years I had been working as a server at Maison Delacroix, a French-American fine dining restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, on the kind of street that still had gas lanterns and cobblestones, and the particular unhurried elegance of a city that understood what it was and had decided to be exactly that, deliberately and without apology. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a 19th century merchant's counting house, and the renovation had kept the original brick walls and the wide plank heart pine floors and the pressed tin ceiling, layering them with linen and candlelight, and the kind of professional stillness that costs a great deal to create and looks entirely effortless from the outside. The head chef, Pierre Blanchard, was from Lyon by way of 15 years in New York, and the food was the kind that made food critics write sentences they were proud of. The room held 44 covers on a good night, and every one of them was typically full Thursday through Saturday, the reservation list running 3 weeks out at minimum for walk-in requests, and considerably longer for anything that required a specific table. I had come to Maison Delacroix by an unusual route, which is worth explaining, because it matters to everything that followed. I was 31 when the story starts properly, a graduate of the culinary program at Johnson & Wales with an additional year of study at Le Cordon Bleu Paris, the Paris one, not the American franchise, and 3 years of kitchen experience in New York, first as a prep cook and then as a line cook at a restaurant that received 1 Michelin star the year after I left. I had left because the head chef, a man of significant talent and almost clinical cruelty, had made the kitchen an environment that was extracting more from me than it was giving back, and I had recognized that fact precisely and acted on it, the way I tried to act on things I recognized precisely.
I came to Charleston because my grandmother had lived there the last decade of my life, and because I had always felt the city fit me in some inarticulate way, the way places sometimes do. I came to Maison Delacroix because the front-of-house manager at the time, a woman named Clara Whitfield, had been in my culinary class at Johnson & Wales, and had called me when a senior server position opened and said, "Come, you'll understand why when you see the kitchen." She was right. I understood immediately. Pierre's kitchen was quiet in the way that very good kitchens are quiet. Not silent, but organized, the noise purposeful and controlled, nothing wasted in either motion or sound. He ran it with a precision that came from conviction rather than fear, and the food that came out of it reflected that. Each plate a considered thing, not performative, not constructed for the Instagram of some future diner, but made to be eaten and to be remembered as something worth eating.
I had started in the kitchen, briefly, before Pierre and I had a conversation about my background that ended with him suggesting, with the blunt practicality of a man who called things what they were, that my French and my palate and my particular ability to read a table would be wasted behind the pass. He had moved me to the floor 6 weeks after I started, and I had been a senior server for 3 years when the night with Harrison Bale happened. The floor at Maison Delacroix was mine, in the way that spaces you have worked in for years and understood completely become yours. Not owned, but inhabited so thoroughly that you carry the map of it in your body, know its rhythms and its pressure points, know when a table is about to need something before they know it themselves. I knew the 8 tables in my section with an intimacy that would seem excessive to someone who had never worked a room at that level. I knew that table 4 by the window caught the late afternoon light in a way that required suggesting sunward-facing guests be repositioned if they were arriving at 6 for a 2-hour meal, because the glare hit differently by 7:30. I knew that the couple who came every third Friday and always asked for table 6 were celebrating something they never named but always dressed for, and that they should receive the amuse-bouche with a word of acknowledgement that treated the occasion as significant without naming it. I knew that Pierre sent his best plates to tables he respected, and that the distinction between what table 2 received and what table 8 received on a complicated evening was partly a function of whether the server had given him information about the diner's engagement with the food, and that giving him that information was part of my job. The job paid well by server standards, significantly above the industry average when service and the occasional per-bottle commission were included, and I took it seriously in the way I took things seriously, completely, with the kind of attention that left nothing unexamined. I had been told by multiple guests over 3 years that I was among the best servers they had encountered anywhere. I had been told by a food writer who had come to review the restaurant and stayed to chat afterward that I had explained a dish in a way that made her want to go to Lyon.
I had been told by Pierre once, in the specific and economical way he offered praise, that I was good for the room. That was the sum total of what I needed from this job, alongside the income, and I had it. But there was, beneath the surface of a job I was good at and a room I understood, something that had been building for a year and that I had not yet decided what to do about. The restaurant was being sold. Not publicly. Pierre had not announced it. The staff had not been formally told. But I had known for 4 months, in the way that people who pay close attention to the machinery of the places they work know things before they are officially reported.
The buyer was a hospitality group out of Atlanta called Meridian Properties, and Meridian's portfolio, which I had researched with the thoroughness of someone gathering information before making a decision, consisted primarily of high-volume, high-visibility dining experiences, the kind of places that were photographed and featured and talked about, that had excellent bar programs and private event spaces and celebrity chef affiliations, and that produced revenue in a way that a 44-cover room with a 3-week reservation list and a Lyonnaise chef's personal convictions did not. Meridian buying Maison Delacroix was not going to result in Maison Delacroix continuing to be Maison Delacroix. It was going to result in something that used the building and the name and the location and converted them into an entirely different kind of proposition. I had understood this. Pierre had understood this. What I did not yet know was the specific shape of what Meridian intended, or the timeline, or whether what I was planning in the back of my own head, the thing I had been turning over for 8 months, like a stone you keep examining to see if it's still the same stone, was viable in a way that the next several weeks would either confirm or collapse. What I had been planning was a restaurant of my own. Not the same kind of restaurant, not the same scale or ambition, not 44 covers and a 3-week reservation list, not right away and possibly not ever, but a small, specific thing, a 20-seat place with a single daily menu and no reservations, and a focus on the food my grandmother had taught me to cook, which was the food of the Périgord, the southwestern French countryside, the duck confit and the walnut oil and the wild mushroom preparations that were so far from the architectural plating of contemporary fine dining that they existed in a different register entirely. Honest and earthy and deeply flavored, the kind of food that had nothing to prove because it was made from conviction rather than ambition. I had a business plan. I had a financial projection. I had a space in mind, a former bakery on an emerging block in the North Central District that my friend Lena had flagged 6 months ago, now sitting empty and available at a lease rate that the projections could support. What I did not yet have was the money for the build-out and the initial operating capital, which I had been working toward for 3 years, and was close enough that I could see the number from where I stood, but not yet sufficient. The gap was approximately $40,000, and I had been working, quietly and carefully, on how to close it. This was the situation on the evening that Harrison Bale came to table 6.
I had been told during the reservation confirmation call that the party of 4 included Mr. Bale, which the caller mentioned in the specific way that assumed the name should mean something. I had looked him up after the call because I looked up notable reservations as a matter of habit, wanting to know who was coming and what context might be relevant. Harrison Bale, 54, founder and primary shareholder of Bale Capital Group, one of the Southeast's more prominent private equity firms, with a portfolio that included, among other things, Meridian Properties, the hospitality group that was buying the restaurant I worked in. He had a profile in a business magazine from 2 years prior that described him, in the carefully admiring way business profiles describe wealthy men, as direct to the point of discomfort and known for a transactional intelligence that leaves little room for sentiment. The photo showed a tall man with a silver-touched haircut and a face that had learned to arrange itself into something that looked like ease without actually being it. He arrived at 7:15 with 3 companions, 2 men in their 40s who had the collaborative bearing of subordinates at a working dinner, and a woman who appeared to be approximately 30, whose specific role in the gathering I did not immediately categorize. They were seated at table 6 because the reservation had requested a window position, and table 6 was the best window position in the room. I brought the menus. I introduced myself. I gave them the evening's amuse-bouche with an explanation that was appropriately brief and technically accurate. Harrison Bale received this with the particular quality of attention that very busy, important men deploy at restaurants, present enough to be polite, clearly also doing something else in his head simultaneously, the quality of a man for whom dinner is a context for a conversation he has already begun in his mind. He didn't look at me directly. He scanned the menu with the practiced efficiency of someone who eats at restaurants like this regularly enough to have developed a rapid assessment process. He asked a question about the duck preparation, in English, directed at the table rather than at me, the way some guests do when they want to perform thinking aloud more than they want to ask a server a question. I answered it. He nodded without looking up from the menu. His 2 companions asked additional questions that were easier, about the wines and the tasting menu structure. The woman with them asked about the vegetarian option in a way that suggested she had looked at the menu online before arriving and already knew the answer. I gave it to her with a pleasantness that she received with the slight surprise of someone who had expected slightly less. I took their drink orders and moved toward the bar, and I thought, walking away, the specific thought I had about a certain category of guest. This table is going to require management, but it's manageable. What changed, and when precisely the evening tilted, was the second table visit, when I came back with the wine and was ready to take the food order. I was standing at the table, order pad in hand, when Harrison Bale turned to his companions and began speaking in rapid, precise, upper-class French, the regional accent of Paris's 16th arrondissement, the accent that belongs to people who were educated at certain schools in certain neighborhoods and carry that education as a form of social signal. He was speaking quickly enough and with enough assumption of privacy that the implication was clear. He did not expect me to understand. What he said, to his companions' quiet amusement, included, "The help clearly doesn't understand what we're saying, which makes this considerably more enjoyable. Ask her to describe the rabbit. I want to see how she explains it." He picked up the menu with a small, satisfied smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. One of his companions, the one to his left, who had a kind face and now looked slightly uncomfortable, glanced at me and then quickly away, which told me he had registered the situation and chosen to say nothing, which told me something important about the social architecture of the table. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment, because it deserves precision. There was no immediate flash of heat or anger. What arrived first was a particular stillness, the kind that comes not from shock, but from the brain recognizing a situation it has been prepared for, even if only theoretically, and reorganizing very quickly around it. My hand was steady on the order pad. My face was composed in the practiced expression of professional attention that I had spent 3 years perfecting. The room, which was full and loud with the specific warm sound of a good dinner service, continued around us without interruption. Nobody at any adjacent table had understood what Bale had said, but I had understood it, every word,
and I was now running through a very quick and very clear calculation about what to do with that understanding. My grandmother, who had grown up in the Périgord and raised my mother in Lyon, and arrived in Charleston at 61 with her particular French and her walnut oil and her patient instruction of her American granddaughter, had told me once, I was about 12 and we were in her kitchen, and I had been frustrated by something I can no longer remember, that the most powerful thing you could do with an advantage was wait until the moment when using it would matter most, and then use it completely. She had been talking about something domestic and forgettable, but the instruction had stayed with me in the way that instructions from grandmothers do, when they are delivered with the specific authority of someone who has learned a thing from living rather than from reading about it.
I thought about that instruction in the 2 seconds between Harrison Bale's French sentence and my response, and then I responded, in French, in the same register and the same regional precision he had used, with the specific vocabulary of a person who had studied at Le Cordon Bleu and worked for 3 years in Paris and grew up speaking the language with someone who was from the place where it had been made. I said, addressing him directly, with the professional pleasantness I had maintained throughout the evening, "Monsieur, I would be happy to describe the rabbit. We can feed the legs slowly for 6 hours with thyme and garlic from a farm in the Low Country, and finish the loin in brown butter with a celery root preparation that I think complements the dish better than the traditional mustard sauce, though we can certainly offer both. As for the duck, we use the breast only, seared and rested, served with a reduction that Pierre makes from the carcasses. He considers it the best part of the animal." I paused, precisely 1 beat. "Would you like the tasting menu, or shall I take individual orders?" The table went absolutely still.
Not the whole room, just table 6, in a radius of about 8 feet, a pocket of complete quiet in the middle of a full dining room. Harrison Bale looked at me for the first time in the entire evening, really looked, with a directness and a focus that had not been present before, as if I had materialized for him in a way I hadn't previously. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, reassessment, the specific discomfort of someone caught in a performance they had assumed was private, and then something else, something more interesting, a kind of recalibration, the expression of a man who had encountered something unexpected and was deciding what to do with the encounter. His companions had gone the colors of a variety of uncomfortable feelings. The woman to his right had put down her wineglass. The man to his left, the one with the kind face, was looking at his napkin. I waited. I held the order pad in my hand.
I maintained the professional pleasantness without adding anything to it, without triumphalism, without edge, because neither was necessary. What I had said had done its work entirely through its content, through the simple, devastating fact of being understood, and adding anything to it would have diluted the effect. The room continued around us. Somewhere behind me I could hear a table laughing at something, and the ambient warmth of a full Saturday service, and Pierre's kitchen working at the pace that a full Saturday service required. Bale cleared his throat. He set the menu down. He said in English, "The tasting menu." The words were even and controlled, and carried, underneath the control, something that I recognized as a man deciding to reframe rather than concede, which was the move I would have expected from someone described in a business profile as transactionally intelligent. He said in a tone that was attempting to be pleasantly offhand, "You speak excellent French." I said, equally pleasant, equally even. My grandmother taught me. She was from the Périgord. I wrote down the tasting menu for 4.
I asked if there were any dietary restrictions I hadn't already noted. There were none. I thanked them and moved to the next table. But what happened next, what happened over the following 40 minutes of service, and then the following 3 days, was not something I had planned for when I responded in French. The response had been instinctive, in the way that using a skill you have maintained carefully is instinctive. The preparation was deliberate. The deployment was immediate. What came after was not instinct. It was a sequence of events set in motion by a single moment of being seen correctly, and the sequence went in directions I had not anticipated. The first thing that happened was that table 6 ate their dinner.
They ate it in the particular, focused, slightly subdued way of a table that has had something unexpected occur at the beginning of the meal and is still metabolizing it. I managed the table with exactly the same attention I would have given any table of 4 at the end of a Saturday service. Precise, warm, responsive without being obsequious, the kind of service that is invisible when it's working correctly. The food was, as it was reliably on Pierre's best nights, extraordinary. The rabbit was particularly good. Pierre had adjusted the celery root preparation that week in a way that I had noted and mentioned to him the previous service, and the adjustment had resolved a slight imbalance in the dish. When I brought it to the table, I described it briefly and then stood back and let the food speak. Harrison Bale ate everything on his plate with a focused attention that told me more about him than any amount of conversation would have. He was, whatever else he was, a person who respected serious food when it was in front of him. The bill at the end of the evening was $480 before gratuity. The gratuity, when the card slip came back, was $140. That was 29%, significantly above the standard 20%, and significantly above what I had expected from this particular table. I looked at the slip in the way you look at things that are different from what you expected, noting the data without drawing immediate conclusions, and I put it in my apron and moved on. What I didn't know when I pocketed that slip was that there had been a conversation at table 6 during the dessert course, when I had been occupied with 2 other tables, that I would only learn about 3 days later, but I'll get to that. The rest of Saturday's service concluded without incident. We had a late walk-in at 9:15 that I negotiated into a seat at the bar, with the cocktail menu and a promise of the cheese program, which they accepted graciously and seemed happy with. Pierre closed the kitchen at 10:30. I did my side work, counted my tips, said goodnight to Clara and the bussers, and walked to my car through the Charleston night, which was warm and smelled of the pluff mud from the harbor and something blooming in a nearby garden. I drove home to my apartment in the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood, and I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water, and I thought about the evening in the specific way I processed significant evenings, not dwelling, not dramatizing, but reviewing, cataloging what had happened and what it meant, and what I would do differently or the same. I thought about Harrison Bale's expression in the moment after I spoke. I thought about the tipping percentage. I thought about the fact that Harrison Bale was a shareholder of Meridian Properties, which was buying the restaurant I worked in, and I thought about what that connection meant and whether it meant anything usable. The following Tuesday, I was in Pierre's office, a small, cluttered room behind the kitchen that smelled perpetually of coffee and the particular sweet sharpness of fresh herbs, for what I had requested as a brief conversation about my scheduling for the following month. Pierre was behind his desk with the coffee he always had, a small cup, black, the same coffee he had been drinking since before I worked for him. He looked up when I came in and gestured to the chair across from him, and waited with the patience of someone who knew this conversation was not entirely about scheduling. "You know about the sale," I said. It was not a question. He nodded, once, with a quality of acknowledgement that was also a quality of relief. Someone who had been carrying a thing alone and has been handed permission to set it down. I said, "Meridian is going to change everything." He looked at me for a moment. "Yes," he said. His English, after 20 years in America, still had the particular music of someone who had learned it as a second language and kept the music as a choice rather than an accident. "They are buying the location and the concept and the name. What they make of it will be their own thing. I will be finished here." He said it without bitterness, which made it heavier rather than lighter. "And you?" he said, looking at me with the particular attentiveness he reserved for things that mattered. "You will be finished here also, I think, if you stay." "I'm not planning to stay," I said. I told him about the 20-seat restaurant, about the Perigord menu, about the space on the North Central block, about the business plan I had been writing for 8 months. He listened with the focused attention he gave to food descriptions, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said in French, because some things were better in French, and we both understood that, "Your grandmother's food." I said yes. He said, That food is harder to make than what we do here. Not technically, in the other way. I said I knew.
He said, "You'll need money." I said I needed $40,000 and that I was approximately $15,000 short. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at me. He said, "I may be able to help with that." I waited. He said, "I also want a place to eat when I am no longer feeding other people." The dry, specific humor of it made me laugh, and he smiled, the small, genuine smile that was the best version of his smile, and we talked for 20 minutes about the specific project and the timeline and the logistics, and I walked out of his office with a different understanding of the situation than I had walked in with. But that was Tuesday. Before Tuesday, there was Monday, and Monday was the first piece of the sequence I had not anticipated. On Monday morning, I received an email through the restaurant's contact form, the general address that guests used for reservations and inquiries. The email was from an address I didn't recognize, but the signature identified the sender as James Whitfield, Chief Operating Officer, Meridian Properties. It said, in the efficient manner of someone who didn't use two words where one would do, "Miss
Aldrin, I understand you were the server for Mr. Bale's party on Saturday evening. He would like to speak with you directly about a potential opportunity. Please reply at your earliest convenience." I read it twice. I sat with it for a moment. The particular quality of stillness that arrives when something unexpected appears and requires assessment before action. Harrison Bale wanted to speak with me. The man who had spoken in French to humiliate me, who had eaten my table's food with the attention of someone who actually cared what he was eating, who had left a 29% tip, and apparently had a conversation at the end of the evening that had produced this email. That man wanted to speak with me directly, about a potential opportunity. I thought about what kind of opportunity a man in Harrison Bale's position might have in mind, and I thought about the sale of the restaurant, and I thought about the fact that I was 3 weeks away from having the conversation with myself about whether to sign a lease on a former bakery in North Central Charleston. I thought about all of those things with the systematic clarity I tried to bring to decisions that mattered, and then I replied, "I'm available for a call Wednesday afternoon or an in-person meeting Thursday if preferable." He replied 20 minutes later, Thursday, 1 p.m., his offices in the French Quarter of Charleston, the building address appended to the email. I wrote it in my calendar, and I spent the rest of Monday thinking about what I was walking into and what I wanted to walk out with. I want to tell you about the night before that Thursday meeting, because nights before important things deserve their full description. I did not sleep well. I was in bed by 11, which was early for me on a day I didn't have a late service, and I was awake at 2, with the particular alertness of someone whose brain has decided that remaining unconscious would be irresponsible, given the magnitude of what is pending. I went to my kitchen and I made chamomile tea, because coffee at 2 in the morning was not wisdom, and I sat at my kitchen table in the dark with the under-cabinet light on, and I thought. I thought about what Harrison Bale's office would look like, and how I would sit in it, and what I would say, and what he might offer. I thought about the kinds of offers that come from men who run private equity firms, not the offer of a peer to a peer, but the offer of a person who has capital to a person who has skills, which is a different kind of conversation and requires a different kind of preparation. I thought about the restaurant I wanted to build, the 20-seat room, the Perigord menu, the daily specials written by hand on a blackboard in the specific confident scrawl I had been practicing in my head for months. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that Thursday meeting as a person with a clear thing she wanted versus a person who had not yet decided. And the difference between those two positions was the difference between a negotiation and a performance, and I had no interest in performing. I got up and opened my laptop. I pulled up the business plan. I had been through it many times, but I went through it again at 2 in the morning with the fresh attention of someone who knows they are going to be asked about it and wants every number to be exactly right. The financial model was sound. The projections were conservative. I had built them with a pessimism that a business professor I had consulted would have called responsible, and a restaurateur I had consulted would have called exactly correct. The revenue assumption in the first year was based on 12 covers per service at a modest average check, 6 services per week. Even at that conservative baseline, the business reached break-even in month 11.
By month 18, with the reputation curve I had modeled based on what I had observed at comparable establishments, it was profitable. The thing I was building was real. It had been real for 8 months, and the numbers confirmed it every time I ran them. What I needed was the money to begin, and what I needed from Thursday was clarity about what kind of money was being offered and what it would cost me to take it. I closed the laptop at 3:15. I went back to bed. I lay in the dark and I thought about my grandmother standing at her stove in the Charleston house, the particular smell of duck fat rendering in the pan she had brought from France and that I had inherited when she died. The way she narrated what she was cooking in the half-French, half-English mixture that was the language of her kitchen. The food she made that was not impressive in the contemporary sense, but was made from a conviction so deep and so unhurried that eating it felt like being told a true thing about a place. I thought about that food, and I thought about the restaurant I wanted to make for it. And then I stopped thinking and let myself sleep. And when I woke up, I was ready. Bale Capital Group occupied the top 2 floors of a building on East Bay Street, with harbor views that cost more per square foot than most of North Charleston. The lobby was the kind of lobby that has art rather than decoration, and a receptionist who had been selected for a combination of competence and appropriate visual communication of the firm's level of operation. I gave my name and sat in one of the chairs and waited, and I noticed things the way I noticed things in rooms I was assessing for the first time. The quality of the light, the materials, the way the furniture was arranged to communicate specific things about power and ease, the small details that said, this organization took its presentation seriously and had the resources to execute it well. None of it was intimidating in the way I think it was designed to be. It was instead informative. James Whitfield came to collect me, a compact, efficient man in his mid-40s who shook my hand with the practiced warmth of someone for whom introductions were a professional frequency rather than a personal one. We rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and he walked me to a conference room that had, as I had expected, a view of the harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows, the late afternoon light on the water doing the thing Charleston light did over water, all gold and restless. Harrison Bale was already in the room, standing at the window, and he turned when I entered with the specific quality of attention that I recognized from Table 6, the full, recalibrated attention, the attention of someone who had updated his assessment and was now looking at the updated version of the person in front of him. He offered me his hand. "Ms. Aldrin," he said. His voice, in English, was low and measured. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I said. I sat in the chair he indicated, across the conference table from him, and I put my hands in my lap and waited. I had decided, in my 2 a.m. preparation, that I would let him make the first substantive move. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said in French, and the fact that he chose French was itself a communication, an acknowledgement of what had happened at Table 6, an attempt at a different kind of footing. "Your French is excellent. Where did you study?" I answered in French. "Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, and my grandmother was from the Périgord. She taught me before I spoke English." I paused. "I understand you're involved in the purchase of Maison Delacroix." A statement, not a question. I watched him process the fact that I had said it directly, without being led to it. He nodded. "We close in 6 weeks," he said, switching back to English, his native comfort, I suspected. "The plan is to reposition the concept significantly. More volume, expanded bar program, private event capability. The brand has equity in the name and the location. The kitchen program is going to change considerably." A brief pause. "Which means the staff situation is going to change considerably." He looked at me with the directness that the business magazine profile had described, and it was genuine directness. Not aggressive, not unkind, but entirely uninterested in softening the delivery. "I had an interesting dinner Saturday. The food was excellent. Your service was exceptional." He said the last word as a factual assessment rather than a compliment. "I also had a conversation over dessert with James about what the new operation is going to need in terms of front-of-house management, a general manager for the repositioned concept. Someone with serious food knowledge, wine knowledge, and the ability to manage a room and a staff at high volume. I made some inquiries after Saturday.
You have a reputation that goes beyond this one restaurant." He stopped. He looked at me. "I'd like to offer you the position. It pays $120,000 base, plus performance bonus. You'd be running a room 3 times the size of what you're managing now." The conference room was very quiet. Through the window, the harbor light was doing what it had been doing, indifferent to the conversation happening in front of it. James Whitfield, who had been sitting slightly to the side of the table, had the expression of someone who had watched his employer make offers before and was calibrating the recipient's response with professional attention. I thought about $120,000. I thought about what that number meant relative to my business plan and the $40,000 gap and the former bakery on the North Central block.
I thought about it for exactly as long as was honest, which was approximately 3 seconds of real consideration. And then I thought about the Perigord menu and the 20-seat room and the handwritten blackboard and my grandmother's duck fat pan, and I understood with a clarity that was almost physical what my answer was and had always been going to be. "Mr. Bale," I said, with the professional pleasantness I had maintained through the entire meeting, "that's a generous offer, and I appreciate the consideration that produced it." I paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'm going to decline. I'm opening my own restaurant." His expression shifted, not to disappointment exactly, but to the particular alertness of someone encountering information they hadn't accounted for. He said with genuine curiosity, "What kind of restaurant?" I said, "Small, 20 seats, single daily menu, the food of the Perigord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where?" I told him the neighborhood. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said something I had not expected, in French again, and this time the tone was different from either the table conversation or the opening of the meeting. It was quieter, more personal, the tone of someone saying something they actually mean, rather than something they have decided to say. He said, "My mother was from Sarlat. I haven't eaten that food since she died." Sarlat was in the Perigord. I looked at him across the conference table, and I thought about the Saturday dinner, and the 29% tip, and the email, and this meeting, and I rearranged several things in my understanding. He was not a man I was prepared to like unconditionally, and the French at the table performance had been what it had been, a small, precise cruelty aimed at a server he had expected to have no defenses against it. But he was also apparently a man who ate the duck confit with the attention of someone who was eating something it actually meant something to eat, and who had a mother from Sarlat, and who had organized a business meeting on the basis of recognizing that he had been wrong about something.
Those things were complicated together, and I sat with the complication for a moment. I said, "If you'd like to come when we open, I'll make sure you have a table." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I appreciate that." We looked at each other across the table, and there was a quality to the silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of 2 people who have understood something about each other that they had not understood before. Then I stood up, and he stood up, and we shook hands, and I thanked him for his time, and I left. But what I did not know as I walked out of the building into the Charleston afternoon was the last twist, the one that was already in motion, the one that would arrive in my inbox 48 hours later and change the arithmetic of everything I was building. The email came from James Whitfield. It arrived on Saturday morning, 2 days after the meeting, while I was at the farmer's market in Marion Square, selecting produce for a dinner I was making for Lena that evening.
I was standing at a vegetable stall with a bunch of fingerling potatoes in one hand when my phone buzzed, and I read the email with the particular quality of attention that important emails require, standing between a stall of summer squash and a woman examining tomatoes who had no idea what was happening 2 feet to her left. The email said that Harrison Bale had reviewed the relevant information and, in light of the conversation on Thursday, wished to make a different kind of proposal, not an employment offer, an investment offer. Meridian Properties had a small restaurant development arm, Whitfield explained this in one sentence, which was probably all it needed, that occasionally took minority equity positions in promising independent concepts at opening.
Bale was proposing a $45,000 investment in exchange for a 15% equity stake in the new restaurant, with a detailed term sheet attached that Whitfield noted I should have reviewed by an independent attorney before responding. He added, at the end of the email, and not as part of the formal business communication, but in a register slightly apart from it, that Mr.
Bale had asked him to mention that the conditions included no operational involvement and no editorial influence over the menu or the concept, which conditions had been specifically requested by Mr. Bale himself, and not standard to Meridian's typical term sheet. No operational involvement, no editorial influence over the menu, $45,000, which was $5,000 more than the gap in my business plan, which would not only close the gap, but leave me with the cushion that a first-year restaurant needed desperately and rarely had, and a 15% equity stake held by a man who had a mother from Sarlat and who ate duck confit with the focused attention of someone who was eating something that mattered. I stood at the farmer's market with the fingerling potatoes and my phone, and I thought about all of it for a long time. I thought about independence and what it meant, and whether this kind of independence, the kind purchased partly with someone else's money in exchange for a partial ownership stake, was the independence I had been building toward.
I thought about what 15% meant in practical terms, and what it meant in terms of control, and I read the term sheet with the attention it deserved, standing there between the squash and the tomatoes. And what I found was that Whitfield's description was accurate. The conditions were genuinely non-intrusive. The equity stake was passive. There were provisions for buyout at market rate after 5 years if I chose to exercise them. There was nothing in the term sheet that gave Meridian any say in how I ran the room or what I cooked. It was, as investment terms for a first restaurant went, among the cleaner ones I had imagined encountering. I called Lena. She answered in 3 rings, which was Lena's version of saying she had been waiting for something interesting to happen today. I read her the email. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Get a lawyer, read it properly, and then make the decision that lets you open the restaurant." She paused. "The one with the blackboard." I said I would. I bought the fingerling potatoes and I drove home. The attorney I hired to review the term sheet, a woman named Rebecca Thorne, who came recommended by Clara Whitfield, and who had the particular brisk efficiency of someone for whom small business transactions were a language she spoke natively, reviewed it in 2 days and came back with 3 suggested modifications, all minor, all protective of my operational autonomy in edge cases the original document had not addressed. She said at the end of our meeting, "These terms are genuinely favorable for a first restaurant equity deal. The modifications strengthen your position. If they accept the modifications, I'd take the money." Meridian accepted all 3 modifications without negotiation, which told me the modifications were not challenging their real interests, which were consistent with what the term sheet had said they were. I signed on a Wednesday. I resigned from Maison Delacroix on the same Wednesday. Pierre and I had a conversation in his office that lasted an hour and ended with his producing, from a cabinet behind his desk, a bottle of Sauternes he had been saving for something, which he said this qualified as. We drank it at his small table with the office door closed, and he told me things about the restaurant he had never told me during the 3 years I had worked for him, about the year it opened, about what he had wanted it to be and how long it had taken to become that, about the ingredient vendors he trusted and the ones he didn't and why, about the specific preparation of the duck that I had been describing at tables for 3 years without knowing its full history. I listened and I drank the Sauternes, and I thought about the room I had inhabited for 3 years and what it had given me, and I felt, which surprised me, genuinely sad about leaving it, which meant I had loved it more than I had consciously acknowledged. Pierre walked me to my car at 11:15 and shook my hand in the French way, firmly and with eye contact, and said in French, "Your grandmother would be pleased." I said I hoped so. I drove home. The next 4 months were the months of building, which were harder and more specific and more consuming than anything else I had done in my professional life, including Le Cordon Bleu and the Michelin-starred kitchen and 3 years of Saturday night services at Maison Delacroix. The former bakery on North Central needed a new ventilation system, which ate $6,000 that I had budgeted for other things, and required a renegotiation of the equipment timeline that Clara, who had agreed to consult on the project, helped me navigate with the efficiency of someone who had opened restaurants before and knew exactly which panics were solvable and which required revision rather than more effort.
The 20 seats I had planned became 19 when the fire marshal made a determination about the egress path that moved a door and absorbed one seat. I lost 2 weeks of the build-out schedule to a permit delay that Rebecca helped resolve, and that Clara, when I called her at 10 at night from the construction site, as entirely normal and entirely infuriating and entirely surmountable. It was all 3 of those things. Pierre came to see the space 3 weeks before opening. He stood in the middle of the unfinished room, the brick walls exposed, the floor sanded but not sealed, the kitchen visible through the pass where the equipment had been installed the week before, and looked at it with the focused attention he gave to things he was assessing seriously. I watched him look. He walked to the kitchen and stood at the pass, and looked at the layout, and then at the equipment, and then back at the layout. And after a long moment he said, in French, "The arrangement of the stove relative to the pass is good. Who made that decision?" I said I had. He nodded once, the specific Pierre nod of an assessment confirmed. He said, "The room is right. The size is right." He looked at me. "You are ready for this." He said it not as encouragement, but as a factual determination, and it landed, as his factual determinations always did, as exactly the right kind of weight. The restaurant opened on a Thursday in late autumn, which was not the day I had planned for the opening, but was the day the inspector signed off on the last certification, and there was no reason to wait.
I had 19 seats, a handwritten menu on a blackboard, walnut salad with lardons, confit duck legs, mushrooms braised in the juice from the jar that my grandmother had taught me to keep going in the refrigerator like a perpetual fire, a cheese plate with local accompaniments, a walnut tart that I had made from her recipe with the specific adaptation of using local pecans alongside the walnuts because the terroir required it. I had one server, a young woman named Priya who had learned fast and had the right instincts. I had one prep cook. I had myself in the kitchen, which was where I had always been most fully myself. Every seat was filled by 6:30. I had told no one, no press, no social media announcement, no review solicitation, and the room filled anyway, through the network of people who knew what was coming and had been waiting for it, which was its own kind of validation.
I cooked for 3 hours, and then I stood at the pass between courses and looked at the room and heard the particular sound it made. Quiet conversation, cutlery against plates, the specific resonance of a room where people were paying attention to what they were eating. And I thought, this is the sound. This is the exact sound I have been trying to make. Harrison Bale came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week. He came alone, which was not what I had expected, and he sat at the small table by the window. There was only one window, facing the street, and he ate the full menu with the same focused attention he had given the food at table 6, which I observed through the pass, with the intermittent attention I gave all my tables during service. When he was finished, he asked to speak with me, and I came out of the kitchen wiping my hands on my apron, and he stood up when I approached, which was a different kind of gesture from the man who had not looked at me at Maison Delacroix. "The confit," he said. His voice had a quality it had not had at the Thursday meeting or at the restaurant, a quality that arrived, I thought, when someone was setting down something they carry.
My mother made it exactly like that. The same preparation. I haven't had it since she died, and I didn't think I would again. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." I looked at him across the small restaurant, and I thought about everything that connected this moment to the one at table 6. The French, the humiliation that had backfired, the meeting, the investment, the months of building, the opening, this particular Tuesday. And I thought about my grandmother, and the pan, and the walnut oil, and the conviction she had put into food that had nothing to prove. And I said, I'm glad. And I meant it. And the meaning was complicated and real, and it was enough. The blackboard was still on the wall behind the pass, in the hand I had been practicing for months, with the menu I had written that morning, in the specific dark chalk I had ordered from a supplier in France, because the color was exactly right. The duck fat pan was on the stove, the one my grandmother had brought from France and that I had inherited.
The one I had kept through every kitchen and every apartment and every version of this plan, which was now, finally, in the kitchen it had always been meant for. Every morning I lifted it from its hook and set it on the burner, and it weighed exactly what it had always weighed, which was exactly right. Some things you carry not because of what they represent, but because of what they are. And what this one was, in this kitchen, on these mornings, was exactly what it had always been, the beginning of something worth making, in a room I had built, with a language my grandmother had given me, and no apology required. He leaned across